Friends, thanks for being with us as we start the week a day late, continuing through the Gospel of John. We're in the 19th chapter. We are jumping back in at verse 8. Jesus is again before Pilate, and we'll start reading here, come back, and have some conversation. Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. Therefore Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench in a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed him over to be crucified. So a couple of things here as we move through this story. The first is the Bible's behind-the-scenes look at what's happening in Pilate's heart, in Pilate's head. And we get maybe more of this expounded on in some of the other Gospels. But even here, John gives us this line, Pilate was afraid. And it's not clear what he's afraid of. Maybe he's afraid of harming an innocent person, though that doesn't seem to be in keeping with what we think we know of Pilate. Maybe the implication is he's afraid of God, though he's going to turn around and do the thing that he ends up doing anyway. There is a little bit of a sense here in which John, I think, is doing two things, Michael. One, he's showing us that Pilate perhaps gets backed into the corner. Verse 12, where they say, "If you release this man, you're no friend of the emperor." That's the equivalent of a threat. I mean, that the idea that Pilate would be doing something against the emperor or in contradiction to the emperor is a dangerous kind of thing to have out there. And so maybe John is saying that Pilate is compelled or forced to do what he does. However, on the other side of that I think implies and implicates some really interesting things, implies some interesting things, and implicates the Jews to a great extent.
Yeah, no doubt. In fact, I think this is one of the quizzical aspects of this part of the text, Clint, is because in one perspective, or on one hand, John has been laying out this rising rivalry between the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, and Jesus throughout the entire book. And it's really gone from, high to blazingly high. And we're at this point now where the crowd is really without any kind of nuance at all. I mean, ultimately, it is just unanimous. It is single-voiced. It is pointed in such a clear and compelling way to these people. That is, on one hand, clear in John's telling of the story. I just want to I want to point out, though, a line that should really take us and really push us back in our seats, because Pilate says here in verse 15, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." That is an unconscionable statement. If you understand some of the history of this place, if you understand the fact that when Passover is happening, the Romans have on their calendar year, Passover will result in us bringing legions of soldiers back to Jerusalem and literally surrounding the temple because there's been so many rebellions, right? There's been so many people coming and whipping up crowds. This is a tumultuous time in a very tumultuous place. The idea that the chief priest would stand before the people and proclaim that the king that they have as the emperor is unbelievable from historical standards. So I think these two things live in an incredible tension here. On one hand, the hatred for Jesus is so pure and so developed and so mature. And maybe you would even say the fear of Jesus, of what he represents and what he could bring if he was to live into this kingdom, that he must be killed and that the chief priest must say whatever needs said. On the flip side of it, the fact that they would be willing to say, or that John casts them of saying something so heretical, so outside the realm of believability, it is another side of this difficult behind the scenes kind of tension you speak to, Clint. There's a lot happening here. You might just read this and think, man, Pilate seems like he's got his hands tied. But I think that the way that John tells the story sums up some of these previous themes while simultaneously kind of pushing us to wonder, like, wow, how is it you end up being able to say these things, which you couldn't imagine being said in any other context?
I think all the Gospels do this, but I think, John follows suit here. To have these words in the mouth of the priest is akin to blasphemy. I mean, to appeal to the emperor and to threaten Pilate with not being loyal enough to Rome, or then at the end here, we have no king. Remember that just a couple of passages ago, they wouldn't go in the palace so they could stay clean for the Passover. And I think this is one of the ways, and it seems subtle to us, but if you're reading this in Jesus' day and time, this isn't subtle at all. This is a baseball bat. And this is a club. We have no king but the emperor. The Jewish priests are saying this. It only feels subtle to us because I think we don't get the shock value of it. But I think this is one of the ways the gospel shows us how far out of bounds these men have to go to bring charges against Jesus, what they're willing to give up to get their way, and the kind of collusion that they're willing to have with the Roman authority and with the powers, and the way that they're willing to coerce people in order to do this ungodly thing that they're trying to do. Again, it's easy to miss as we read it, but this is a staggering thing to hear from the chief priests, to the extent that many scholars think that this must have been added later. I mean, and you can make up your own decisions about that, but it is that stunning that some have suggested that there's no way they could have said something like this. It really is remarkable.
There is definitely a telling of Jesus' story here, but Clint, we've said this before. John is also preaching in so many of these texts. There's a lesson here. I think a really good example of this comes in verse 10. Pilate says to Jesus, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and power to crucify you?" So at theme is the idea of power, that Pilate has earthly power. And then Jesus' response in verse 11, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." On one hand, the economy of Jesus using this to turn the guilt back upon the people bringing him to Pilate is amazing. I mean, it's succinct and powerful. But don't miss this idea that Jesus is ultimately saying to the one who is correct in his assertion that he has the civil military power to take Jesus's life. And Jesus's response to that was, well, yeah, you've been given that power, if you have it, from a power higher than yourself. And by the way, a military man would understand that idea. A military man, well, yeah, the emperor gives me the power to do this, right? But we know, readers of John, Christians, we know Jesus isn't talking about the emperor. It's not the emperor's power that will take Jesus' life. It's the fact that God himself has granted the power. And you said so many times in this study, it bears repeated here, Jesus is always in control. Even in the moment of this story where Jesus has the least physical control to the human eyes, we look at Jesus in that moment. He's been beaten, he's been bruised, he's been abused. Now he stands in front of a man with the power of the military, the power of the sword, and he is at the bottom. And yet, as John tells the story, that's absolutely not the case. These people do not understand who they're dealing with. And that's the incredible irony that's built into this entire book. But I think this is the shining heart of it, because here we have all of these powers combined. We have the worldly power, we have the religious power, we have God himself. And the question is, who has power? And Jesus is saying, you only have the power that you've been given.
Yeah, and I think there's a subtle and very interesting connection that comes out of that verse. You know, Jesus says, as you pointed out here, Michael, you would have no power over me unless it had been given. Therefore, the one who handed me over is guilty of a greater sin. Pay attention when you see words repeated in the scripture, because if we jump down here to the last verse 16, what does it say of Pilate? Then he handed him over. Pilate has now done the very thing that Judas has done. Pilate had doubts. Pilate tried to release him. Pilate claimed that he had authority. But ultimately, when it came down to it, Pilate too, though we may say John has a softer sentence on him, Pilate too is guilty, because we use the exact same phrase, then he handed him over. So Pilate, like everyone else in this story, leaves Jesus alone to his fate. Now, that is, as you said, Michael, that's no surprise to Jesus. That's no particular change in Jesus' plan. Jesus knew it was headed here. But lest we be too soft on Pilate, Pilate takes his place in having some guilt of this as well. And he, in the very words that were used of Judas, now also becomes one who hands Jesus over. And I don't think John wants us to miss that, because he uses the exact same phrase.
I want to take one quick step out of the nitty-gritty of the text and just to look at this from a higher perspective, from the view of motivation, right? What's motivating the religious leaders here in this story? We've seen it so many times in John already. They're motivated by the fact that Jesus is turning people against the religious order, the way that things are done in the religious structuring of Jewish life. Jesus is calling people to a new kingdom, to a new way of understanding God's working in the world. They can't have that. Pilate here is motivated by self-preservation. He's motivated by protecting against riots and the idea of subversiveness and just trying to keep the status quo. Even the man who has the military strength behind him is caught really circling the wagons for his own benefit. And that's the thing. When he hands Jesus over to a mob who wants Jesus dead, they're really doing the same thing. They're all trying to preserve self. They're all ultimately trying to get rid of this Jesus figure because he's a threat to them. He risks the reality of the life that they've come to take for granted being overturned. And I think that is this amazing portrayal here in this story that yes, we might want one of these groups to bear more guilt than another, but the honest truth is, Clint, they're all here for the same reason. And that is ultimately they're just trying to keep everything as stable as it can be so they can keep on living their lives the way it was. And Jesus has no interest in that. He's come to reveal the way of God. Jesus' revelation is final and complete and perfect. There's really no turning back after this first revelation that we see in Jesus Christ. Every time that follows it will now forever be changed. And the reality is, those who encounter Jesus in the judgment seat, I mean, we literally have this idea that Pilate's going to now sit in the place of making a judgment over God. Ultimately, humans are going to fail. They're going to lose courage, and they're going to no longer understand. And ultimately, Pilate gives over because he too is at the end interested in his own self-preservation.
And then the exact moment that every human in the story is trying to gain and exercise their power, Jesus is giving his up, is sacrificing his. And John, as we've said many, many times, is a very good storyteller. And when you pause to read slowly and listen between the words and the lines, I think John paints a wonderful, compelling, certainly very inspiring picture of Jesus, who is always in the center.
That's well said. I just want to illustrate that very briefly as we come to the end of our time together. This is a detail you might read by, but verse 14, now it was the day of preparation for Passover, and it was about noon. And we've told you this numerous times before, the importance of light in this story, who comes to Jesus at night, who comes at day. It is striking that at noon, the sun is up and it's bright. And in this story, the idea that at noon this is happening, John is tipping us off. Something revelatory is happening here. This is a clear picture of God's intention. And we should be struck that the sun is up at noon at the very moment that ultimately Jesus is being called a king, right? Notice that. Here's your king. That has about 14 different meanings, right? On one hand, it's used as a term of derision here, and on the other, an accurate portrayal of who Jesus is and who Jesus has called himself to be. And this is revealed at noon.
And John's going to do something fascinating with that idea of king in the story that we'll look at tomorrow.
So hope you'll join us for that. We're grateful for those of you joining us as we go through this whole study. Subscribing is the easiest way to stick with us. Liking this particular video is the best way to help others find it. We're grateful to spend time with you today.
Thanks, everybody.